All right, so we are continuing in our Apologetics series, and today we are going to finish up the evidences for God's existence. So if you recall, in the first week we spoke about how the fact that the universe had a beginning points us to the fact that there must be a transcendent, meaning spaceless, timeless, and non-material, a transcendent, uncaused first cause of the universe, which would be the most basic definition of what we would call God or what other worldviews might call God, right? And then last week, we did a deeper dive into the fine-tuning of the universe, namely that against all odds, our universe was finely tuned for the existence of life. So this fine-tuning argument is actually half or the first part of what's called the teleological argument, which is the argument from design. The second part of the teleological argument is the argument of God's existence based on our biological complexity. So we're going to look at that today. We're going to look at consciousness and the mind as the fourth argument for God's existence. And then last, the fifth one, we will talk about objective morality as evidence for God's existence and evidence for what we can know about God's nature. So first up, we have biological complexity. The two main points that I want to emphasize or talk about today are, number one, that the information coded in our DNA is complex, it's specific, and it can only come from an intelligent mind. And number two, life can never come from non-living things. So for that first point, we'll start with, it helps to understand that information can be both complex and specific, or complex or specific. And what I mean by that, I think it's good to look at an example of like a baby. If you put a baby next to a computer and they bang on the keyboard, they might produce a very complex string of characters on the computer screen, but it probably and almost certainly means nothing. It's usually going to be gibberish. It's not specific. It's not informative. On the other hand, you can have a teenager and they might type something like a simple sentence, something like, I don't want to do my homework. I don't want to do my homework. This sentence is not as complex. It's very short, but it's very specific and it's very informative. Now, if you compare both of these examples to a 10-page paper, maybe written by a college student, this paper is both complex, but it's also very informative and it's very specific. It has complete sentences, it has proper punctuation and grammar, and it tells a specific story or gives a specific message. Now, what are the odds that a complex, informative paper could be written by chance if we allowed a baby to just bang on the keyboard for like 1 or 2 hours straight? It's similar to that question that we posed a week or two ago, like what are the chances that a functioning computer might randomly get put together in a junkyard if we gave that junkyard 1 million years, 1 billion years to just sit there? I'm sure we could do some kind of mathematical calculation to show that the odds are extraordinarily very low, but the chances are basically zero, right? So what happens when we look at our own DNA? DNA contains what some people would call digital information. It's called digital because it's a genetic code that is written in 4-letter sequences. You guys are probably familiar with this, right? A, T, C, and G. This can be translated into binary, which allows this data, this real data, to be stored, to be copied, and to be read. So DNA is made of 2 twisting, paired strands. You're probably looking at this picture in your mind right now because you've seen this in your science books, maybe when you were in school. Each strand is made of nucleotide paired bases, right? A always pairs with T, C always pairs with G. You might be having flashbacks like I did when I was preparing this. The human genome, if we think about the human genome, it contains about 3 billion base pairs, and all of these reside in 23 pairs of chromosomes within the nucleus of all of our cells. Just amazing to think about. Each chromosome contains hundreds to thousands of genes. A gene is a region of DNA which is basically the molecular unit of heredity, and these genes carry instructions for making proteins, and we know that proteins are essential for all living organisms, right? They're essential for the structural components of body tissues, muscle, hair, collagen, enzymes, antibodies, all of these things. Proteins are made up of chains of amino acids, and there are 20 standard amino acids that can form proteins. So I'm mentioning all this because if you look at the numbers, right, you can have an amino acid that's 150 sites long, which means you would have 1 times 10 to the 195th combinations of amino acid base pairs. We talked about these kinds of numbers when we were talking about fine-tuning. It's a very, very complex and very specific and informative system, right? And I just gave you the number for 150 sites long. I believe most are 300 or 400 sites long. So in conclusion, the specified complexity found in the information in our DNA points us to an intelligent designer. It is fact that this kind of information, which can be found in things like a computer or in a book, always originates from an intelligent mind and never by random chance out of pure physical or chemical processes. So you may have heard this before, but every code has a coder and every message has a message giver. So where did the information in our biology come from? We believe that evolutionary biology fails to give any sort of explanation or good explanation or source for this information, and that the fact that this was something provided by an intelligent designer, that this would be the best explanation. So that's the argument from biological complexity. Now we move on to a new set of evidences, and we're going to talk about our consciousness as evidence for both God and the fact that humans have a non-material soul. So scientists and philosophers, this is a very profound topic, really. We could probably do a deep dive, but for many, many centuries, scientists and philosophers have wrestled with the precise relationship between the brain and the mind. The basic question is this: is our brain equal to our mind? Are they the same thing? And then once we answer that question, the follow-up question is, if they are not the same, then what is the relationship between the two? Does one come from the other? Do they depend on one another? How do they depend on one another? And I think if we just start from that first question, which I think is easily answered by considering what we call the law of identity. So this states that if two things share every attribute with one another exactly and in every way, then they are the same. But the brain and the mind do not share every attribute exactly the same and in every exact same way. So for example, the brain is obviously visible when you dissect it, but nobody can see the mind. And even if a neurologist can pinpoint the location of your brain where there is neurological activity, the neurologist can never look at you and read your mind, or look at the brain and activity and read your mind. The mind is something you cannot see. It has intentionality, it has free will, it has the ability to form thoughts and to have personal beliefs and to have feelings. The brain has physical properties, and you can measure these physical properties. It has a weight, it has, height, length, and even, again, I just said electrical activity. But the mind is what we would say is measureless. Our desires, our sensations and feelings and emotions, they can cause electrical activity, but we cannot measure those actual desires, feelings, and thoughts themselves. So in other words, the brain is a biological, you could say, machine whose physical activity is measurable, but the mind is the experience of that activity. They are very much linked. So if you alter electrical signals through things like drugs or through stimulation, it could alter the mind, but we cannot convert the qualitative feelings and thoughts that we have into purely quantitative measurements. So having said that, I will note, just as a side note, that there are studies that claim to show that by looking at electrical patterns in the brain, you can predict what a person is thinking. But what they don't tell you, or sometimes fail to tell you, is that they had already shown these test subjects objects beforehand. So these predictions are based on patterns that they have already seen, based on things that the subject had already observed. So basically the conclusion is, number one, the non-material mind could never have arisen or come from or evolve from the material mind from naturalistic processes. So once again, this points to the fact that a mind can only come from a mind. Life can only come from life. A mind can only come from a mind. It means that the transcendent creator and cause of our mind has to be a personal being. It tells us that while human consciousness has a very deep integration and causal connection to the brain, consciousness resides in the mind, pointing us to the existence of an immortal, non-physical and non-material soul that would persist even after death. It tells us that we truly do have free will and that we can be held accountable for our choices and the things that we do, which points to the existence of objective morality, which we will talk about in just a second. But before we talk about that, the second thing I wanted to mention is that if someone believes that the brain and the mind are the same, and then the conclusion or obvious step to follow there is that our thoughts and our choices are purely a result of our biology and our chemistry because it evolved from that. And that would tell us that free will is just an illusion. And because it's just an illusion, we cannot truly hold people responsible for their actions. Because, hey, someone might just be acting this way or behaving this way because that is just how they naturally evolved. So how can we hold them accountable? Furthermore, we can never actually even claim to be rational creatures if we are just purely a result of our biology and chemistry. We can't really trust what we feel or what we think. And furthermore, if purely physical and naturalistic, then we do not have a soul. And once we die, we simply die, we cease to exist. So the implications of these things, whether the mind is the same as the brain, or is the mind actually a separate thing, the implications are very big. And it leads us to the last piece of evidence, which I will talk about today, which is morality. So, personally, I would say that of all the pieces of evidence or arguments that we've talked about, morality was the first one that really grabbed my attention, and I still think it's one of the most powerful pieces of evidence for God, personally, in my opinion. So, let's talk about morality. You can really only believe one of two things about morality. Either morality is a matter of opinion, which is called subjective morality, or there is a standard of morality that transcends human opinion, and we call this objective morality. So in other words, objective morality tells us that there really is such a thing as right and wrong. Right and wrong are very real things, and the decisions we make have very real implications. C.S. Lewis, who you probably know about, he talks about this in detail in his book Mere Christianity. He points out the fact that every human being is born with an innate or an inherent knowledge of morality. We all have this deep sense of right and wrong. The only thing is, obviously, each of us we're calibrated differently in terms of how we view morality, meaning that we all have our own opinions about what's right and what's wrong, but we all have this deep sense of justice based on that. But that's why we have arguments, because we see things from different perspectives. Most of the time, we only have parts of the truth or only glimpses of the different perspectives involved. So this sense of right and wrong is also the basis of what we would call our conscience, right? So the question is, where does this innate sense of morality come from? And just like we said before that every code has a coder, every message has a messenger, we're going to say this time that every law has a lawgiver. The innate sense of right and wrong points us to a lawgiver who transcends humanity itself, since this lawful standard goes beyond human opinion. And because it goes beyond human opinion and it transcends us, this standard has to be unchanging. Unlike humanity, who changes all the time, it has to be all-knowing. It must be all-knowing. Unlike humanity, we don't know everything. It must be perfectly loving and perfectly just. Why? Because the moral law from God, just like the laws we come up with on government levels, right? These laws are based on the assumption, which I would even say is based on the fact, but let's just say laws assume this, the assumption that human life has inherent dignity and inherent worth, and that all life is worth protecting and giving justice to. Does that make sense? So where does this inherent human value come from? If our human value and dignity and worth does not come from being created by God and being created in God's image, then every other proposed explanation is really just a matter of opinion. And I think it helps to take a look at how people often try to explain where morality comes from. So many times if you talk to people about this, they will try to explain the origins of morality to say that it is not objective. Because if they were to admit it is objective, then it would imply that there is a transcendent God who is basically the source of objective morality. So, the most frequent argument that I personally hear, and maybe you do too, is that morality comes from societies and cultures. Right? Have you heard this? So, if this were true, then by definition, a minority within one culture or society could never be morally right. And just that there by itself doesn't make sense. It denies an immoral minority the chance to argue logically against a quote-unquote moral majority. Then there's the question of, hey, what constitutes a majority anyway? Then the other question, what if there is no majority? What if there are three equally held beliefs within a society? How would you adjudicate what is right and wrong at that point? So if we keep it on this level, right? Think of slavery. Think of genocide. Under this belief, to be consistent with this belief, then it would mean you would have to believe that it used to be moral for African Americans to be enslaved. And then morality just changed over time, so then it became immoral. Under this belief, to be consistent, you would have to believe that it was moral to kill 6 million Jews during the Holocaust, and then only because things change over time, cultures change, societies change, now we see those things as immoral because our culture has changed. And then if you even think of like baby sacrifices in ancient cultures, just because the majority of people did that doesn't mean that it is morally right. So now that's just within one society and culture. If you have a disagreement between two, between three, which is exactly what happens when you have wars, then who will dictate who is actually right between two societies, two cultures, two countries? There has to be a standard of morality that transcends all countries, that transcends all humanity. So hopefully you can see that there are many, many problems with this position. Again, it is the one that is most cited by people when I talk to them about morality being subjective or objective. And this is the one that most people say. But there are many problems if you were to say that morality simply comes from cultures and societies. Another argument that people make is that morality is dictated biologically by what allows for survival, what allows for well-being, and what allows for human flourishing. But once again, there are problems with this, and I might have mentioned this, a couple weeks ago. But first of all, you're already starting with the assertion that human survival, well-being, and flourishing are good things before you've even established how good is determined. Does that make sense? But even if you were to ignore that for just 1 second and allow that to be so, the fact is, what allows for survival isn't always a good thing. Murder can aid in your survival, but that doesn't mean it is a morally good thing. Acting on instinct doesn't automatically mean that you're doing something good. And then practically speaking, people might feel strongly about arguing against objective morality, but in everyday experience, the reality of objective truth, if you watch, it dictates their very behavior. They will get mad if you slap them in the face for no reason. Even though in their worldview, you are entitled to be of the opinion that you can slap just anyone for no good reason. But the question is, should I not slap you in the face just because I'm afraid of the personal and social consequences, such as maybe you slap me back or you press charges, to the police? Or should I not slap you in the face because I would actually be wrong to slap you in the face, because I should actually respect you and I should actually acknowledge your inherent worth as a human being? I think the answer to that, I hope, is obvious. And then the last point, going back to the conversation we had about the brain and the mind, if someone believes that we are purely a result of our biological and chemical evolution, they might actually admit and say that, hey, morality really is just an illusion. There really is no such thing as morality. So for one person to believe this and to believe in a purely naturalistic worldview, that would be consistent on their part. I will just remind us of the problems. That means we don't really have free will. That means we don't have rationality, nor do we have the ability to make genuine decisions, which means that there really is no such thing as morality, and human beings, we don't actually have inherent worth. And when we die, we simply cease to exist. It also means that we cannot hold people in prison, whether they are serial killers or worse. We cannot hold them, accountable for their actions, because according to this worldview, they're just a byproduct of their biology and their molecules in their body. They don't really have free will. They don't really have control. Everything that happens is just deterministic based on all of these things. And there's really nothing special about humanity. We are just the same as animals, and many people really do believe that. So, in conclusion, our innate sense of morality comes from God. And the fact that all humans have inherent worth and dignity, this is because we are created in God's image, right? Our innate sense of morality is calibrated differently from one another, but this points us to a standard that actually transcends humanity. If laws exist, there must be a lawgiver, and the objective standard for right and wrong comes from God's very nature. And He alone is the judge. He alone is the adjudicator of all right and wrong in the universe. And I love how this argument or evidence bridges us to the gospel, right? We talk about sin, and people sometimes hear the word sin and they run away because, hey, that's a churchy or religious term. But I explain to people, all we are meaning by sin is that we have done wrong, because right and wrong are genuine things in this world, in this universe. There is such a thing as objective morality, meaning there is right and there is wrong. And this existence of objective morality points us to the gospel of Jesus Christ. It points us to how God's love is perfect, God's love is just, and one day He will make right all things that are wrong. But the gospel of Christ tells us that He extends grace, He extends mercy, and He allows both love and justice to exist perfectly. He allows for forgiveness of sin, and He does this by taking on that punishment Himself. So again, I think it's a beautiful bridge to the gospel, and maybe that's one reason I love this argument so much. So yeah, that's the end of the, I would call the natural theology series. Next week, the plan is to go through the evidence for the reliability of the Bible, how we know the Bible is divinely inspired. And then the week after that, we will end this apologetic series by going through the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. All right, any comments, any questions before we close? Amen. No, I love that passage in Ephesians, and it even says, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of His might. So I love that God gives us the tools we need, the weapons we need, but also He gives us the strength that we need. And part of that is prayer, part of that is relying on the discernment of the Spirit, and that's why we pray to be filled with the Spirit. And it's always important when we're talking to people, and I have to remind myself as well, I'm not going to win them with arguments. I have to be discerning about how to share what I'm sharing, share it with genuine truth, be honest, and then allow the Spirit to work in them, because it's only going to be by the power of the Spirit. But we do our part, which is why we learn these things. So I really applaud you guys for having a heart to learn this, and I just appreciate your time and attention every week, and encouraging me to do this. All right. So, as I mentioned, next week we are going to do the Word in person in Collegeville. We're going to try to get a room. We'll do our teaching in the room. And then, Dia, you are here. We are going to go out and treat Dia for lunch afterwards. So anyone who can make it to Collegeville, you are invited. Just let me know. I'll try to send it. I will send an email out to see who might be available. All right.